right, hey leaders, welcome to another Theology Thursday. So I'm glad you guys clicked on this video. Fair warning, this one may be a touch long. I think it will be worth it. I hope that you find that it will. And second warning, this one may feel like a radical concept. So bear with me if you feel yourself getting nervous or anxious or you're sweating, or stay with me to the end of the video. I think that this conversation that I'm going to start with you today, it may prompt several more conversations that I really want us to have, and I think it'd be good for us as leaders and ultimately our church. So let me jump in, and I'm going to be looking down a lot because I had to make a lot of notes for this video. Typically, I do this from memory, but I wanted to get really specific on this one, and I want to start with a question that I alluded to the other day at our meeting, and I've asked several of you personally, and it's, have you been discipled? Have you been discipled? So don't get defensive. Don't worry about all the implications there. But I just want you to think about, have you been discipled? And of course, how you answer that is going to depend upon how you think about discipleship. Let me put forward just a couple statements because before you answer, notice what I did not say. I didn't say, have you been in a Sunday school class? I didn't say, have you been in a small group? And I didn't say, have you been in a Bible study? Now, can discipleship happen in a small group, Sunday school class, and a Bible study? Yes, is the short answer, of course. Can you have people in your Sunday school, Bible study, small group, and them not be discipled? And the answer is yes. So we really talked about that a little bit the other night. If you weren't able to make that meeting, hopefully this will be able to catch up in this video some. But basically the premise is that we can have people in our groups and they can stay spiritually immature, and they can stay in our groups for months or years or decades and still remain in spiritual immaturity. So one of the things that we really want to focus on is not just gauging their attendance in a group, but are they taking steps closer towards Jesus? So that's kind of the angst, if you will, that's really driving the conversation. So back to the question: have you ever been discipled? Here's what I want us to lean into a little bit. If you take away all of the churchocentric ways, and I'm going to teach on that in just a second, have you been discipled in a Christocentric way? So let me make some distinctions. Churchocentric, which is really just a big mashup of saying like it's centered around the church, the programming of the church. Here's a couple notes that I wrote down. Churchocentric means of discipleship would be centered around the organization. So case in point is a small groups ministry. It also typically involves rooms and resources being provided by the church. So discipleship, you wouldn't even consider it really happening outside of, even if it's in a home small group. It's still got a sense of churchocentric because the church has me, I guess, representing the church. I'd be communicating with a small group leader. We'd be making sure there's a host facility or home. We'd be making sure there's childcare if there's needed. I'm working behind the scenes with that. So there is church organization revolving around even the rooms and the resources. And then ultimately, the number one thing that churchocentric does is it works incredibly well in connecting people together. If we just say from the stage on a Sunday morning in a sermon, hey, you guys ought to develop friendships and do life together. Okay, amen. Go ahead. Go do that. That's difficult. Now, some of the extreme extroverts, before the music's even started, the extroverts have already made 5 friends on the row, and they've got phone numbers, and they're going to lunch with this family, and some of you are able to do that. But for the most part, if we just say, hey, go ahead and do life together, ready to go. It just doesn't happen that way. So I'm not throwing churchocentric under the bus. That's what leadership is we're helping lead people into relationship and fellowship with other believers. So I'm not knocking churchocentric, but I am making a distinction that churchocentric and Christo or Christ-centric is different. So let me just unpack Christocentric just a little bit. Is essentially that we are following the model of Jesus, that we are doing it in a way that would look more like how Jesus did it and less how the modern church would do it. Still, not throwing the modern church on the bus. What we do can be very effective. The other thing about Christocentric is that it really doesn't have to rely on the church at all. Some of you have experienced this already in your life. You've been discipled by somebody, or you have discipled somebody that You never met inside the walls of the church. The church didn't introduce the relationship, maybe through work or a friend or a neighbor. You guys entered into a discipling relationship that never required Hickory Grove Baptist Church getting involved. So that's the distinction I want us to make, is that there is the church-driven organizationally, and there is the Christ model, which is where we are to seek and save. We are to go. It's very individualistic driven. So have you ever been discipled in the Christocentric way? How did he do it? So we'll start at the 5,000 foot view and let's work our way in. Jesus for sure preached to large crowds. The famous one in Matthew, feeding the 5,000, and he performed miracles both privately, but certainly several of them were public miracles, which also drew large crowds. Jesus also taught in the synagogue. So we're talking about now being confined to the building in a more of a formal structure of worship. So we see him, massive ministry. Then we're doing ministry inside of a typical context of the synagogue. But then it funnels pretty aggressively from there. And the one that you and I are the most familiar with, and the one that our churches typically emulate the most, is the leading of the 12. So the 12 disciples that we are most familiar with, when you consider what our small group ministry does, it really kind of mirrors that model of leadership, where you gather enough people to where it's a little bit of a crowd, but not so many people that you're not able to have intimate relationships with people. You know their name, you know what kind of food they like to eat, you know where they live. There's details that gets exchanged there. So we stop, and I don't just mean like Hickory Grove, like we, the church, we will typically stop at this. We've got a few exceptions on our campus where we've got larger Sunday school classes that have really kind of taken that model. And there's effective ways to do that too. Typically, the larger a group is, the harder it is to connect relationally. So, some of the real big churches out there, they may have groups and classes, whatever they're called, 150, 200, 250 people in there. Well, there are churches that don't run 250 people. So that's kind of an in-between that's not really mentioned a whole lot in Jesus' ministry. We're going to see that more in Acts and really shortly after Jesus leaves the earth to ascend to the right hand of the Father. We're going to see more of that moderate size ministry. But for the most part, Jesus jumps from a fairly large crowd to all of a sudden doing life with the 12, and the church typically stops there. So I can see why, when I first asked the question, have you ever been discipled? If in your brain you're jumping right to, yeah, for sure, I've been in a small group for a long time, or obviously I'm leading one right now, it would be very easy to say that yes, I've been discipled, and a great argument can be made that you indeed have. However, I think that if we look at the life of Jesus and we look at specifically the life of the disciples, we have to honestly say that there were levels of intimacy with Jesus that the disciples had, that some had that and others did not. Many will point out, well, that's not really fair. And the truth is, Jesus and his kingdom has never really operated under fair. He's always had his chosen people. He's had his plans and his ways that he's going about. It even says that there are governments that are sitting upon his shoulder. So there are nations and people and churches. Think about, why does God bless some churches immensely and he doesn't with others? The biblical way of saying that is God is sovereign, which is kind of a fancy way of saying that we don't understand his ways and we're not God, so we should just let him be God. But the truth is, amongst the 12, we see a different kind of relationship with Peter, James, and John. And then I would offer, to be honest, Peter gets elevated even a little bit higher than the other two. Matthew 16:18 is a peek into this. He's the only one that gets named in such a way where he's really saying, like, you're going to be a foundational leader for the church. It's a big moment, Matthew 16:18 is. The other one I'd point out to you is after Peter has experienced failure, after he denies him 3 times, what does he do? He goes fishing, and he takes them with him. The disciples are like, I guess we'll go fishing too. And there's a moment where Jesus shows up and Peter loses his mind. He jumps out of the boat, he's sopping wet, and then Jesus is all of a sudden he's making breakfast on the shore. And really it's for all the disciples to see, but that moment was really a moment between him and Peter. It's when he asked him 3 times, do you love me? Of course, Peter says yes, and then 3 times he tells him in slightly different ways, then feed my sheep, feed my lambs, take care of my flock, feed my sheep. So I don't know where you would draw your line of in your past history, what it looks like. For many people that would call Hickory Grove home, the only interaction they ever have with us is things like the egg hunt, right? So that's that 5,000 foot view. They're like, oh yeah, I go to that church's events. If someone only came to the egg hunt, would it be honest for them to say, yes, I'm being discipled? If someone only ever comes on Sunday morning, they don't participate in any leadership or groups, or they don't serve in any of our ministries. They just attend and they just worship. Just by sitting under Bill's preaching or whoever is preaching that Sunday, would it be honest of them to say, yeah, I'm being discipled? What about if they are in a group and maybe they don't necessarily participate, but they're faithful to be in the group, and they've really not taken any next steps with Jesus, but they are partaking in the community and they are doing life with one another, even if they don't ever share or any participate? Would it be fair or honest of them to say, yes, I'm being discipled? Perhaps, and it really would kind of depend upon how you draw that line, but I think that it becomes much more clear the closer we funnel down to the relationship that we see Jesus and the 3, and certainly Jesus and Peter share. Think about the transfiguration. That was just for the 3 to see. If you're familiar with the transfiguration and all, we see Moses, who's representing the law, and Elijah, who's representing the prophets, and then they're gone and it's just Jesus. And the whole idea is to represent in that moment that Jesus is greater than the law and greater than the prophets. And so there's this powerful moment that they're all experiencing, all being the 3 of them. All 12 were not privy to that. So when you start talking about discipleship on that level, now you're really leading, you're doing more, you're exposing those guys to more than you did the others. Could you say, okay, are they being discipled? And then ultimately with Peter, the 2 examples I gave earlier was, he was being charged with the keys to the kingdom. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loose in heaven. Which is, and akin to you have a job to do and there's an evangelistic purpose of the church, so get to work. And then later, do you love me? Well, then go feed my lambs. So now there's direction given, you have a job to do, there's challenge in there. It becomes that much more explicit. I would love it if every Christ follower on the planet had someone to disciple them the way that Jesus was able to disciple Peter. So how have you ever been discipled? Here's cards on the table. That's where I'm drawing my line. Has anyone ever taken you aside with maybe 1 or 2 other people and poured their life into you and encouraged you and challenged you and edified you? It's easier to commit to a small group than it is to say, hey, every Saturday at 6 a.m., I want to meet you at the coffee shop. And we're gonna walk with Jesus together. It's difficult. So oftentimes the deepest level of discipleship anyone goes to is at that small group level. Look, it's a massive win, and honestly, they're going to stay more connected to the church. But if we're going to be serious about accomplishing the mission, if we're going to boldly try to do 2 Timothy 2:2 and trust a faithful man who will be able to teach others also, it is going to require you and I investing beyond the small group level. So there was an excellent question asked the other night at our small group, at our leaders meeting. And the question was, Matt, what do I do with these people that are never going to lead a small group?